Welcome to Part 2 of Finding U.S. Passenger Lists. Our agenda for Part 2 is learning how to prepare for your search and about records that provide passenger list data. My philosophy is keep it simple, searchers. So the first thing that you can do to help keep it simple is to summarize your completed research. First, select whose passenger list that you'd like to find, and then summarize your research about that person. Write down things like the birth date and birthplace, who they might have traveled with. So think about family members' names and dates of birth, parents, siblings, spouse, children, neighbors, and friends. Then you want to narrow down immigration and naturalization dates. So look over your completed research and find the first piece of U.S. evidence. So the first piece of evidence that you have of them in the U.S. Leave no leaf unturned. Then you want to find all census records that may indicate details about immigration for both them and who you think they traveled with. The census gives some great clues to narrowing down an immigration date. So the U.S. federal census from 1900 through 1930 lists the year of immigration to the U.S. or the number of years the person has been in the U.S. Also for New York State persons, we have the 1905, 1915, and 1925 censuses that ask that same question. In the 1920 federal census, it lists the year of naturalization, which is the year that they became a U.S. citizen, if they chose to do so. In the 1925 New York State census, it asks, if you are naturalized, when and where were you naturalized? And that includes usually the city and year of naturalization, so then you know where to look for naturalization papers. And in the 1855 New York State Census, it asks, how many years were you a resident of this town? So while your ancestor may have gone someplace else than they were living in 1855, maybe the place they were living in 1855 was the first place they settled, and that information could help you narrow down when they came to the U.S. Here's an example, the 1920 census. So we see the Lanza family, we see Salvatore as the head of the household, and towards the right-hand side, it asks the year immigrated, and it says for him 1906, and it asks, is he naturalized? And it says AL for alien. And then we have his wife Paulina and his son Vincent. It says that they came to the U.S. in 1907 and that they were both aliens in 1920 as well. And it looks like the other children must have been born in the United States. If your ancestor arrived in the U.S. after 1906 and was naturalized, a certificate of arrival would have been created as part of the naturalization process. The certificate of arrival provides the immigrant's date, port, and ship of arrival. Generally, you obtain these from the Erie County Clerk's office if they're Erie County, or whatever county clerk, wherever they lived, or the National Archives. This is an example of a certificate of arrival. This is for a gentleman named William Henley, whose port of entry was Portland, Maine. He came on November 1st, 1923 on the ship the SS President Polk. Beginning June 30th, 1906, at naturalization, an immigrant's name on naturalization papers had to match the passenger list. If the immigration name was wrong or had been legally changed, an immigrant could show proof and pay a fee, and the name would be crossed off and changed on the immigration record. Sometimes immigrants just naturalized under the name on the immigration record because they didn't want to pay the fee. There are many stories about people's names being changed at Ellis Island, but these stories aren't true. Immigration inspectors at Ellis Island and other ports of entries use passenger lists that were made by the shipping company's staff, likely the ship's purser. So if a name was spelled differently on an immigration list, that's the reason. immigration officials simply checked people's names off on the passenger list. If someone arrived before mid-1906 and their name was spelled wrong on the passenger list, an immigration official could correct the name using a notation, but the name on the list had to remain legible. This happened rarely, though. Usually a name change was made during the naturalization process. What you see here is a photograph from the New York Public Library. It's people talking to immigration officials. So what they would do is they would line people up in the order that they were listed on the passenger manifest, which was written by the shipping company. And sometimes you can see it looks like they might have something pinned to their shirt. And that was their number, the line number for the ship passenger manifest. So they would all wait in these lines, and then they would go talk to the immigration official. And you can see them sitting at the tables with the big pieces of paper, which were the manifests. And what they would do is they would ask questions related to what was written on the manifest to make sure the person in front of them was the person on the list and that the information given was accurate. With a red arrow, I've pointed out an immigration official. And who this is likely an interpreter. Ellis Island had many different interpreters that could speak all different kinds of languages. So there wasn't a language barrier to someone getting into the country so that people could understand each other. So if your ancestor was naturalized, the Declaration of Intent could give the immigration information. The Declaration of Intent was the first step in the naturalization process. You would file a declaration declaring your intention to become a U.S. citizen. And here we have one for William Henley, who we mentioned earlier. It gives his occupation. He's a porter. A physical description. It says he was born in Mayo, Ireland. And it gives his birth date. And it tells when he came to the U.S. It said that he came to America from Queenstown, Ireland on the vessel President Polk. This is the bottom half of the Declaration of Intent. And it says he arrived in the port of New York about the 3rd day of November 1923. The next step in the process, you had to wait a certain waiting period after filing the Declaration of Intent. Usually it was 3 to 5 years or so, depending on the laws of the time period. And then you would fill out the petition for citizenship. And it gives a lot of the same information as the Declaration of Intent. So here it gives he was from Mayo, Ireland, and that he came to the U.S. from Queenstown, Ireland, and that he arrived in the U.S. in Portland, Maine, under the name William Henley on November 1st, 1923, on the President Polk. So we see two different ports here. So it looks like he first came into Portland, Maine, and then must have traveled down to New York City afterwards. I mentioned earlier where you usually get naturalization records are through the county clerk's office. For Erie County, they have naturalizations going up to 1929, but there's overlap in the places you could have been naturalized. So from late 1906 to the present, you also could have been naturalized through a U.S. district court. And if your ancestor was naturalized through that court, you would obtain the records through the National Archives. And it's really easy to do on the National Archives website, and they're usually pretty quick. Usually you get your response in a week or so. There are many naturalization records available on FamilySearch.org, which is a free website. And your handout that is marked number 1, item number 9, lists more information about using Family Search to get naturalization records. There are some naturalization records on Ancestry Library Edition too, usually for bigger cities like New York City, but there aren't any for Western New York as of yet. Other documents with passenger list information include passports, visas, and alien registration forms. For more information on that, see your handout marked number 1 and item number 9, which will give you more information. You could also look at the passenger list guide that I showed you earlier on the library's website, and that will also give you this information. So that's everything for part 2. Visit us to see part 3, which will focus on how to find U.S. passenger lists with known information, using Ancestry Library Edition, and also using Family Search and other free websites. See you then.